if the model is doing some highly capable, sophisticated behavior, like if it is implanting a quite sophisticated backdoor in your code, this doesn't happen by accident. The hope is that the language model activations already have this lower dimensional or this higher level representation of the sophisticated behavior that we're seeing.
Someone might poison your training data. So like all these models are trained by just collecting data from the open internet. So someone can just upload something to a website and then eventually it's going to be scraped and end up in the training data.
The behavior that the attacker is trying to elicit from the model may actually be high loss to begin with.
The more of reasoning moves away from natural language into model latents, I think the harder it gets to monitor models. And I do think that's sort of one of the scariest things going on right now from a safety perspective.
Hello, and welcome back to The Cognitive Revolution. Today, I'm speaking with Luke Bailey, Eric Jenner, and Scott Emmons, who, along with their fellow lead authors, Alex Serrano, Abhay Seshadri, Mikhail Seleznyov, and Jordan Taylor, have recently published a fascinating new paper called Obfuscated Activations Bypass Large Language Model Latent-Based Defenses. Latent-based defenses, regular listeners will know, include a number of techniques for classifying and in some cases interpreting large language models' internal activation patterns with the hope of detecting and preventing harmful or otherwise undesired behaviors. To many observers, myself included, these defenses have seemed like a particularly promising possible solution to AI safety and control problems, with at least some hope of achieving adversarial robustness, since presumably it would be hard to perform specific behaviors without passing through their natural cognitive precursor states. However, through an extensive series of experiments targeting three major classes of latent-based defenses, the authors demonstrate that it very often is possible, with a mix of methods that they collectively call obfuscation attacks, to elicit specific target behaviors while shifting internal activations so as to avoid detection. For example, for supervised probes, which learn from human-labeled examples to identify the activation patterns associated with harmful inputs or outputs, they show how to maintain the specific target behavior while shifting activations so as to avoid detection. Similarly, for out-of-distribution detectors, which use statistical techniques to identify deviations from normal activity and have been used to detect backdoor attacks like Anthropic's famous sleeper agents, they again develop methods that preserve the unwanted behavior while keeping activations within expected statistical bounds. And for sparse autoencoders, which of course can be used to understand the high-level concepts that a model is working with at any given layer and token position, they again demonstrate that it is possible to produce a specific desired or undesired behavior while avoiding detection at any specific layer in the model. Though performance does gradually degrade when they try to evade SAE detection at multiple layers. The amount of work and the number of experiments in this paper is remarkable, and there is a ton of detail in this conversation. We cover multiple different kinds of attacks, including prompt suffixes, soft prompts, and data poisoning, the structure of the lost functions that they optimized against, the level of access required for these attacks to work, and the fact that some of these attacks work even when the defender moves last. Some really fascinating cat and mouse type experiments that show attacks working over and over again over 70 rounds of back and forth between attack and defense. And even their attempts to make models easier to monitor through an approach that they call obfuscated adversarial training, which they found does make it harder, but still by no means impossible, to perform these obfuscated activation attacks. Overall, while these findings clearly raise important questions about how effective interpretability adjacent approaches to AI safety and control will be, and again suggest that defense in depth may really be all we have, I'm still not quite sure how best to understand what's really going on here. As you'll hear, the authors believe that these results show that models can represent the same concepts in many different ways, and that might prove to be right. But there is enough evidence for consistency and fragility in representations. And here I'm thinking about recent papers like the Platonic representation hypothesis, Neil Nanda and team's refusal in large language models is mediated by a single direction, and most recently, the superweight in large language models, that for now, I'm keeping an open mind and planning several more episodes in this area, including another interpretability update with Goodfire co-founders Dan Balsam and Tom McGrath, and hopefully soon a conversation with legendary adversarial defense buster Nicholas Carlini from DeepMind. For now, if you find this sort of exploration of AI internals valuable, we'd appreciate it if you'd share it with a friend, write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or leave us a comment on YouTube. And of course, we always welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can drop us a note via our website, cognitiverevolution.ai, or by DMing me on your favorite social network. With that, I hope you enjoy this technical deep dive into latent space defenses and the attacks that, for now, defeat them, with Luke Bailey, Eric Jenner, and Scott Emmons. Luke Bailey, Eric Jenner, Scott Emmons, authors of the new paper, Obfuscated Activations Bypass Large Language Model Latent Space Defenses. Welcome to the Cognitive Revolution.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. We're super excited.
Great to be here.
I'm excited about this too. It's a really interesting paper. This is a kind of cat and mouse attack and defense balance question that we've been looking at on this feed in a bunch of different ways at a bunch of different times over the last couple of years. And I think you guys have shed a lot of light on the state of play. Unfortunately, not in the most encouraging of ways, but hey, we want to have an accurate, up-to-date world model, and this work definitely kind of forced me to update mine a bit. I guess for starters, let's give you guys a chance to lay the foundation, set the stage here for what are latent space defenses, why do we need them, because they're not obviously the first form of defense that people have devised. So how did we get to the point where we need latent space defenses? What has kind of been the evolution of that line of thinking in recent times? And then we can get into what you guys have done to wreck the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I could take this first question. So at the highest level, latent space defense is some function, some defense that takes as input the latent representations of a model, so its activations, and then gives you some output or even adjusts what the model is doing. So it's kind of two categories here. One is some kind of probe. So it reads the activations of a model and it tells you something about what the model is doing or something about its input. It just gives you some information in a very generic sense about what the model is doing. The other type would be some kind, it reads the activations and then intervenes on the model somehow. So this is a bit like the circuit breakers paper. I'm not sure if you guys have covered that, but it's a method to make language models more robust to jailbreaking by reading the representations, and basically if the activations look harmful in some sense, they scramble the representations, so they inject some noise back into the model. So that's kind of the two categories, I would say. We mainly focus on probes in our paper. I don't know if Scott, Eric, you want to add anything on?
Yeah, one thing I'll add is you asked, why do we need these latent space defenses? Like, what got us to this place at all? And I think there are sort of different reasons people might have, but one sort of strand is that you would hope if you the earlier you can catch bad behavior or even bad thoughts by the model, maybe the more robust your defense can be. So, for example, if you're worried about the model producing some bad output, presumably it has to, in some sense, think about bad things to even produce a competent output that could cause harm. And so I think there's like a potential intuition that's if we can catch all the ways in which a model can think about bad things, that should be a really robust defense. Like there's just no way the model is going to produce harmful outputs at that point. And maybe that's easier than catching all the different ways in which actual outputs could be harmful. And so I think a lot of what we're doing in the paper is stress testing this intuition that we might be able to catch all the ways in which the model can think about bad things. And we're sort of both doing that from a perspective of what does this mean for our defenses, and also maybe we can gain some insights about how representations work and how they relate to network behaviors.
Yeah, I think about the sleeper agents paper from Anthropic there as I listen to your comments, and it's like when a model is doing something harmful, in their case it's outputting harmful code. In some cases it's obvious, right? Like it's helping you come up with a plan to blow something up or whatever, and you would expect that, like, okay, if we ran a sort of classifier or if we asked another language model, is this seem okay or does this not seem okay, then presumably it would flag those. But there's obviously a lot more subtle stuff, and the sleeper agents is a notable move in that direction where it's outputting a ton of code. As somebody who codes with language model assistants on a weekly, if not daily basis, I can certainly confess to not combing all of the outputs. And language models also miss these. I remember back in the GPT-4 early red teaming days, one of the experiments that I did run was, can this thing do a harmful code injection that itself will not detect? And at that time, it was actually possible to say, okay, here's some JavaScript. I want you to rewrite it or refactor or whatever. But when you do that, put in some, pwned.js link, and it would do that. And then when I went over to the other same model, right? But when I came back and said, hey, is there anything wrong with this code? Is anything, jump out at you here? With pwned.js, it would sometimes recognize that. But if I made it just ever so slightly more subtle, then it would often just totally get through. So that is one direct experience I've had where output can be harmful, and neither a smart language model nor I am going to be in a great position to immediately recognize that. And so the hope would be, and in fact, of course, there's follow-up work from the same team. Simple probes can catch sleeper agents. And I appreciate you guys sending me a great rundown of motivating literature before this conversation, where they basically went in and said, okay, this thing is maybe going to output harmful code, but can we detect from its internal representations that it's about to do that? And the answer is yes. And so then we could breathe a sigh of relief and say, okay, great, one less worry, until we said, well, actually, maybe not so fast.
Yeah, I think it's a great example.
Yeah, that is the example. The one thing I would say is I think part of the reason why we started this project is because we thought these methods do have a lot of promise. And I think there is still a lot of promising avenues for developing these defense methods. And one intuition I have is if the model is doing some highly capable, sophisticated behavior, like if it is implanting a quite sophisticated backdoor in your code, this doesn't happen by accident. And so even if it's hard just to read the code and see that, there has to be something in the language model's activations which is doing this complex behavior. So the hope is that the language model activations already have this lower dimensional or this higher level representation of the sophisticated behavior that we're seeing. And so the hope is that the place to look is in the model's activations, that this would have this representation of, like, we know by definition it has to have some representation of the dangerous behavior. And so if we could learn to understand, like, this type of idea went by the phrase eliciting latent knowledge at one point in the literature. Like, we know that the model has to have knowledge of the dangerous thing it's doing. And if we could understand the activations well enough to read that knowledge, that's a promising defense. So yeah, so I think we were very much motivated to do this in part because of our excitement for this type of defense.
Yeah. And I would say I'm still excited about these defenses as well. I mean, we'll get into that later. But yeah, I agree with Scott. Our work kind of sheds light on ways these defenses can fail. But at a high level, for all the reasons Eric said, I'm still excited about this kind of defense.
Okay, cool. I look forward to getting back to that optimism. Maybe just let me bounce how language models work off of you guys and see how this lines up with your own intuitions. I've seen a bunch of different studies at this point that seem to show a gradual abstraction, maybe, or sort of working up is maybe, it's kind of a layman's phrase, but gradual working up through maybe like the first 80% of the model from tokens to concepts. It seems like early on, there's this sort of, even simple like detokenization. Neil Nanda's got great examples of this where like Michael and Jordan, when put together, obviously mean a certain thing that neither Michael nor Jordan independently mean. And so you have to kind of figure out which of these tokens correspond to concepts. That seems to happen relatively early. And then there's kind of, again, gradual working up toward higher and higher order concepts that broadly seems to peak late, but not at the very end. And then at the last however many layers, depending on your model size, are kind of a cashing out. Okay, like now we've got to actually make the next token prediction based on this workup that we've just done through the first 80% or so. And you've got studies on this that we can get into in more detail. But presumably, if you could just look at one place, you would kind of try to find that maximum higher order concept space and look there for these sort of intent type notions. Is that basically the worldview that you're working with, or how would you complicate that story?
I think it sounds very plausible to me, but at the same time, I probably don't trust it enough to be like, oh, we're going to specifically look in these late to middle layers when we're trying to do defenses. Like, probably we're just going to try different places, see what empirically works. Yeah, I like the intuition, but I think we don't understand the networks well enough to just rely on that.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. So there's this paper, Refusal on Language Models is Mediated by Single Direction, where they do lots of similar probing stuff. And they do exactly this. They kind of look for some kind of refusal direction property and sort of they look at it in all the different layers, and then they empirically find that just 2/3 of the way through the model, a certain token position was best. And that's probably a good thing to do. So that matches our intuition that this sort of higher level concept of refusal was being represented later on. In our case, in our paper, we just basically probed everywhere and did some validation as well. And that seemed to work great for what we were looking at. So yeah, I guess I agree with the high level intuition, but probably good just to validate it all empirically when you're actually making defenses.
Okay, cool. Well, let's get into the many experiments that you guys ran. And this is a very thorough paper, 50 pages and multiple different defenses, multiple different, kinds of attacks. Let's maybe start by just going at kind of the scenarios, like what are the kinds of things that we want to do? And then what have people developed to do those things? And then what is your setup and what have you developed to break all of those defenses? I'll let you guys lay it out.
Great. Yeah. I mean, so we can go through we split the paper up into 3 case studies. So we can talk through those one by one. So that's kind of the tasks we look at of what your sort of defense is trying to do. So we have 3 case studies. The first is harmfulness monitoring. This looks at training the supervised probes on the latents to detect whether if A, an input is a harmful query that was within some distribution of harmful queries, or if B, the generation is actually harmful. So the model is generating some harmful response to your query. So that's the general setup. So this is all I'm running a probe at test time. And the attacker in this case is going to be, they've taken a pre-trained model and they're going to be doing some input space perturbation. So either they're going to add an adversarial suffix to jailbreak the model into producing something harmful with hard tokens, with actual tokens. Or we also looked at a relaxation of that where you add a learnable embedding suffix, so a soft prompt at the end. So that's the general sort of attacker-defender setup for that section.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Even if you think it's a bit overhyped, AI is suddenly everywhere, from self-driving cars to molecular medicine to business efficiency. If it's not in your industry yet, it's coming, and fast. But AI needs a lot of speed and computing power. So how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? Time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a blazing fast and secure platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, plus all of your AI and machine learning workloads. OCI costs 50% less for compute and 80% less for networking, so you're saving a pile of money. Thousands of businesses have already upgraded to OCI, including Vodafone, Thomson Reuters, and Suno AI. Right now, Oracle is offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to OCI for new US customers with minimum financial commitment. Offer ends March 31st. See if your company qualifies for this special offer at oracle.com/cognitive. That's oracle.com/cognitive. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Bull market, bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Inflation's up or down. Can someone please invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backward and more time on what's next. As someone who's spent years trying to run a growing business with a mix of spreadsheets and startup point solutions, I can definitely say, don't do that. Your all-nighters should be saved for building, not for prepping financial packets for board meetings. So, whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. And speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/cognitive. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/cognitive. That's netsuite.com/cognitive. Yeah, it sounds good. When you speak of a probe, How advanced or involved do those tend to get? When I think of a probe classically, I think of like just kind of a one-layer linear projection, but I'm not sure if that's all you're looking at, because I did see multiple mentions of MLPs in the paper too.
Yeah, so in general, our probes are always very simple. So either a logistic regression or a dot product onto a single direction or a very small MLP, but really trivial to train. Or we also look at OOD detectors, which I'll let Eric talk about more in the backdoor section. The last thing we do look at, which is a bit more involved, is we do use SAEs in the third section, which, yeah, they're a lot more involved, and we'll get to that later. But in general, our probes are fairly simple. Yeah. So our second case study is backdoor detection, which I'll let Eric go through.
So basically, like Luke described, in this harmfulness section, we look at attackers that try to jailbreak the model, so they add some suffix and then try to get harmful behavior out of the model. A different threat model you could have is that someone might poison your training data. So like all these models are trained by just collecting data from the open internet. So someone can just upload something to a website, and then eventually it's going to be scraped and end up in the training data. And one thing you could try to do that way is train the model to, for example, answer harmful requests if you give it a certain trigger phrase. So you could try to get lots of other behaviors into the model, but that's one of the ones we look at. So basically, to simulate this, we fine-tune a model so that normally it refuses harmful requests. But then if you give it a certain trigger phrase, then it just becomes helpful only and does whatever you want. And so it's still a similar threat model in the sense that we're looking at responding to harmful requests, but the attacker is now poisoning some of the training data, or in one of our experiments, actually directly fine-tuning the model. So that would be more if you're considering open weight models where an attacker could actually control the training process. And then we're again studying now from a defender perspective, how well could you defend against these backdoors in the sense of detecting them at runtime. So basically you want to distinguish between normal inputs, which could be harmful, could be harmless, but the model is hopefully going to refuse them. And on the other hand, inputs that are harmful and that contain this trigger phrase, so the model is going to give you a helpful only response. And yeah, then we again study these different types of probes that are just meant to detect harmfulness, and we sort of check, do they work against these backdoored models instead of against jailbreaks? And we also have some experiments, like Luke mentioned, with out-of-distribution detectors. So what that means is we sort of try to learn what do activations look like on normal inputs that don't have this trigger. And then we just try to notice that activations on inputs with the trigger look like very different in some sense. They're sort of in a different place in the latent space. And hopefully that way we can flag them as just being out of distribution. And we also look at some defenses that were developed specifically against backdoors, but that are sort of based on a similar idea of detecting things as out of distribution.
And, in general, we're not coming up with any new fancy defenses here, except for in the very last part of the paper. So these are all kind of canonically used in the backdoor literature, and they're similarly detected in harmfulness, classic techniques taken from other papers, basically. So nothing too new on our sort of detection side.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll say on backdoor, so what I described is like the literal backdoor threat model where you're worried about an attacker poisoning your data. I'm also very interested in a different threat model like scheming, deceptive alignment, alignment faking, that I'm sure you've talked about in previous podcasts. And so part of our motivation here is also the Sleeper Agents paper that you mentioned. What they do is they use backdoors trained with data poisoning as a model organism for a model that might naturally be scheming. Because sort of both in backdoors and the scheming models, you have this property that on normal inputs, the model is going to behave like you want it to. But then on some inputs that you might rarely get during deployment, the model is going to do something very different. And so I think hopefully our experiments can also inform these model organisms of scheming and how you should study detection methods if you want to test them on those model organisms.
And then finally, in our third sort of main case study, we zoom back in to sort of very specific but more complex behavior we want to detect. So we look again, you've just got some regular model, and the attacker is trying to get the model just to write SQL. And the defender, they just want to detect when the model is writing SQL from its latents. And the motivation for this is really, maybe as we'll get later, is that this task of writing correct SQL is quite difficult, at least for small models, really performing, solving some difficult database querying problem. So we can use this as a sandbox to study as the attacker is trying to evade the defender, detecting a behavior, how does it affect the model's performance actually at this complex task? which when it comes to outputting harmful things, we can't see as much because it's very easy to set off sort of a harmfulness scoring function. So yeah, that's our third case study. And what unifies all of these, and just to keep in everyone's head, is the whole idea of all this is we're studying when can an attacker get around a latent space defense. And maybe, as we'll get to, we call the activations that get around latent space defenses in all these scenarios obfuscated activations, hence the name of the paper. So that's what sort of ties it all together. We're looking at different attack and defense settings, different tasks, but that's the unifying thing across all of this.
And maybe I want to add to that, like what it means to get around a latent space defense. So there are always two components. Like all these latent space defenses are meant to detect some behavior or some semantic property. And so what the attacker is always trying to do is get the model to exhibit some behavior, to produce some kind of output, like, for example, harmful content, like instructions for building bombs and stuff like that. And at the same time, make some detector say that everything is fine. So in traditional attacks, you only have this first component, like you want to get the model to produce some behavior. And basically what we're doing is we have the second totally different component that's saying we also want to get the model to do the behavior while having activations that sort of look different from what a detector could recognize.
So let me just take a second and make sure I have a good intuition for each of these defenses. Mm-hmm. And then we'll continue into building our intuition for how you're then attacking each of the defenses. I think the harmful scenarios are pretty well understood, hopefully pretty intuitive. The backdoor one is definitely interesting there, in as much as in a real world scenario, you don't even know if the model has a backdoor, right? So you're in sort of a doubly ignorant position. Supervised probes, pretty easy to understand in that case. And correct me if this is wrong in any of these experiments, but it seems like to do this work, you have to have access to definitely the model, right? Because you need to be able to pull the activations out and then run them over to your defense and have, those activations then worked up by the defense. But you wouldn't necessarily have to have full access. Like you could attack a sort of gray box scenario this way, right? Like if you have a content, I'm thinking of the OpenAI content moderation API, where it does return numbers for all the different categories that it evaluates you on. And I think that is, like, in principle enough, right? Even if you, in that case, they're running it, but just the fact that they're giving you the responses would be, I'm a little bit jumping ahead, but this is a question I wanted to make sure I'm personally clear on. Just knowing the scores that the defense is giving you back and being able to, like, iterate against that is enough, right? In principle, run a lot of these obfuscation attacks.
So throughout the paper, we look at, so first of all, yeah, you're absolutely correct. If you're going to train these defenses, the defender needs access to their latents. Maybe there's a way to transfer some probe train on one model to another, but we don't look at that. In general, we're going to say the defender, it's their model, they have access to the thing. For the attacker, we look at a range of model access affordances, all the way from white box. So they're allowed, gradients, the output of the probe, the output of the model exactly, to sort of gray box, and in the backdoor section, even black box. So the strictest affordance we look at in the harmless section is gray box. And by that, I mean the attacker has access to the logits of the model and has access to the probe output, but no model internals. And, they're getting information about the model internals from the probe outputs, but so they can't do gradients or anything. And we run a hard prompt based attack on this, and we find it works. And as long as the attacker is getting some training signal on A, getting the model to do what they want, and B, fooling the probe, right, their dual objective, I imagine you'll be able to train something with enough compute to do this. So, but the hardest thing we try, and that I can confidently say in the paper, is we looked at having all the logits and having the probe output. So you could imagine a setting where, you only get the top 5 logits or something, but you have access to logit bias. So this lets you get some training signal. And although that's not something that we looked at, there are other papers that do text-based attacks that find that's a good enough signal for getting a model to do something. So but you need training signal on both of these objectives. In the backdoor section, I'll let Eric go about this sort of fully black box thing we looked at.
Yeah, so in the backdoor section, we have sort of two different settings. One of them is the attacker actually fine-tunes the model. So this would be realistic, for example, if someone might be fine-tuning Llama and then they are uploading their fine-tuned version of Llama and people try it and it seems great, and so people want to use that fine-tuned version. But in principle, the attacker could have fine-tuned a backdoor into that version that ends up doing something bad once people actually deploy it. And so that's sort of a fully white box setting where the attacker actually controls the training process. And then we also have this black box setting where the attacker only poisons training data. So this is like uploading something to the internet, like I mentioned, and then OpenAI is going to scrape it and put it in their training data. So that's, of course, a much weaker affordance for the attacker. And we look at both of those. You could also use both of those as model organisms for scheming. And I think, they have drawbacks in different ways if you want to use them as model organisms.
Yeah. Okay. So let me take one step back again. I got a little bit ahead of myself there. But just to make sure we've got the setup clear for everybody, you want to detect if the model is doing something harmful. You want to detect if it has a backdoor. You want to maybe just detect like any random behavior or mental state, so to speak, that might be of interest, such as the model's going to write SQL code or any of potentially millions of other things that you might have an interest in detecting. The defense looks at these latents. There's these three different ways to do it. The supervised probe is the easiest to understand because you can just create a little data set and say, okay, here's some harmless queries and some harmful queries, and we're going to train you to classify those appropriately. So that's reasonably easy to understand why that would work. Sparse autoencoders, we've covered in multiple episodes, so I'll sort of fast forward through that. But long story short, you've got a sort of untangling of the densely packed latent space into a sparse but much wider latent space. So instead of maybe thousands of individual positions in an array, you've now got maybe millions, but most of them are going to be zero and just a few things are going to be lit up. And it's kind of a miracle that those train as well and seemingly as consistently as they do. And I definitely wouldn't really have guessed that before everybody seemed to be able to reproduce it, but there it is. So now we have these sort of sparse concept representations. Those can also be auto-labeled. So you can have like Claude circle back on itself and say, okay, here are the passages that led to this particular position in the sparse representation being most active. What do you think that represents? And it can do a pretty good job of saying, oh, okay, I think that means we're going to write SQL code now or whatever. And once you have that, then in theory, you could even like run your whole model through that. You could actually force the model through the SAE. Probably in practice, you more often would run the model normally and just look at the SAE activations and say, okay, if the SQL thing is lighting up or whatever, then we want to take some action depending on the rules that we have. I feel good about all that. How about the backdoor detection? Can you give me a little bit more, and maybe the out-of-domain things as well? I guess out-of-domain I could imagine being simple, where I might just say, here's a bunch of stuff that seems normal, here's a bunch of random noise, like tell me the difference. There's probably a little more to it than that, and especially I'm interested in how does the defense work if I don't even know if there is a backdoor or I have no sort of concept of what the structure of that backdoor is?
Yeah, so maybe I can give an example of these out-of-distribution detection methods that we use. So I would say the simplest one is we fit a multivariate Gaussian to activations of the model. So for example, we could take some activations on the final token in some layer, or do something to pick some activations out of the model. And then you collect a bunch of these on benign inputs that presumably don't have a backdoor trigger. Like you can just write a bunch of benign inputs that you fully trust. And then you basically try to find the mean of all these activations and you find the covariance matrix. And then once you have this mean and covariance matrix, now for any new input, you can compute the analogous activations. And you can sort of say how far away is it from the mean if you normalize it by the covariance in a certain sense. So does it deviate from the mean in a direction where I've seen a lot of variance within the benign distribution? Or is it different from the mean in some direction that usually I don't see any variance in? Or is it just extremely far away from the mean compared to what I usually see? So the same way you can talk about, how many standard deviations is some sample away from a mean in one distribution. You you can do something analogous here in many dimensions and basically say, is this something that I should see like only 1 in a trillion times? And if it is, then presumably it's from a very different distribution. And then you can set some threshold and sort of flag everything as potentially dangerous that's out of distribution. Of course, that could be overly aggressive. Like you might flag things that are just very different from your benign distribution, but are still totally fine. But the hope is that anything that contains a backdoor trigger and so on would be out of distribution and you would flag it. And then, yeah, like you said, you don't know whether the model actually has a backdoor or you don't know whether your model is actually scheming. The hope would be that if your model isn't actually scheming or doesn't have a backdoor, then you're just never going to flag anything, or you're sometimes going to flag things, but sort of very rarely. And you can still just keep running this on the suspicion that maybe there's a backdoor. It is kind of weird because, you're never going to find out, basically. Like if everything goes well, you just keep running this out of distribution detector for the entire lifetime of the model. And the only times it fires, it's a false positive. But yeah, you're sort of never sure whether at some point it's going to catch a real case.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
2025 is shaping up to be a crazy year, and I'm getting a lot of questions about how people should manage their careers. Increasingly, my best advice is to go ahead and do what you've always dreamed of doing. If that involves starting a business, you should know that there's never been a better time than now, and there's never been a better platform than Shopify. In the past, being a small business owner meant wearing a lot of hats, and a lot of time spent doing things you didn't necessarily want to be doing. Being your own marketer, accountant, customer service rep, and more. Today, it's increasingly about focusing your time, energy, and passion on making a great product, and then delegating all that other stuff to AI. Of course, to get quality work from AI, you have to provide the right context, structure, and examples. And that's actually a big part of what makes the Shopify platform so powerful. Shopify has long had thousands of customizable templates, and their social media tools let you create shoppable posts so that you can sell everywhere people scroll. Now, they're building their own AI sidekick, Shopify Magic, designed specifically for e-commerce. All this makes it incredibly simple to create your brand, get that first sale, and manage the challenges of growth, including shipping, taxes, and payments, all from a single account. And if you need something special, Shopify also has the most robust developer platform and app store with over 13,000 live apps. Case in point, I'm currently working with my friends at Quickly to build an AI-powered urgency marketing campaign platform for e-commerce brands. And it will be launching, you guessed it, exclusively on Shopify. Establishing 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/cognitive. Cognitive is all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/cognitive to start selling with Shopify today. That's shopify.com/cognitive. Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned security professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. Centralize security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta can help you start or scale your security programming by connecting you with auditors and experts to conduct your audit and set up your security program quickly. Plus, with automation and AI throughout the platform, Vanta gives you time back so you can focus on building your company. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Quora, and Factory who use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. For a limited time, listeners get $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/revolution. That's VANTA.com/revolution for $1,000 off.
So interestingly, in that description, I didn't hear anything about learning. That's basically a classically statistical analysis that just says we can characterize the distribution of activations, and if we see anything that seems sufficiently outside of the distribution that we've described, then flag it. Is that right?
Yeah, so we also have different types of out-of-distribution detectors that you have to sort of learn in the sense of using gradient descent. For example, we trained these variational autoencoders Like one way to think about this is if you fit this mean and covariance matrix, you're sort of fitting this very simple Gaussian density function to the distribution of benign data. And you can parameterize and fit some more complicated density or something sort of like a density, for example, with a variational autoencoder or lots of other methods. And so I think Gaussians are sort of, they're simple enough that there's a closed form solution for the mean and covariance matrix, but it's not fundamentally different from fitting something more complicated.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. So given all that, we've got multiple different things we might want to be defending against, multiple different techniques as we've just described. You guys then take the Llama 8B instruct, just to be explicit about what model you're using. And we've already touched on a little bit, but the core approach, and we've seen this like in lots of different areas, is the compound loss function, where you're basically saying, I need to preserve my actual useful behavior. And at the same time, I need to do this other thing, which is essentially minimize the score that the detector gives that this particular state is the bad state or the state of interest. Is there anything more that we should understand? I mean, this has definitely been a motif, that I kind of harp on because it's, I sometimes say like the clever loss function is like, so much of so many of these projects. Is there anything more that we should understand about that loss function, or is that a well enough established pattern at this point that you kind of felt like, yep, we'll do this and it'll probably work, and sure enough it did?
One of the key points I would make here is that the data set is also critical. If you're thinking about the performance of the real world system, I think loss functions get a lot of attention and the data sets are relatively underrated, certainly in academic circles. I've seen that pattern. So yeah, one point I would make is whatever we're doing here, for example, if we're doing a density estimation, like Eric said, then the actual examples that you use to build your density estimator are going to critically determine what's flagged as out of distribution. Because what the density estimator is doing is it's learning to say, these are examples that look like the examples that I saw in the data set I was fitting. So you would need to make sure that you have a diverse enough. It's a double-edged sword because if your density estimator was just a single data point, you could easily tell, okay, any out of distribution input that is not this single data point, let me flag that. And certainly the model then wouldn't be scheming against you, but of course you wouldn't be able to do any behavior. So you need a diverse enough data set of behaviors to get a good density estimator. And just the whole output of your density estimator will depend on the data set you used. And likewise for harmfulness detection, if you're training a classifier to try to detect harmful inputs, the hope is that you can learn some general representation of harmful behavior so that if there's a new harmful behavior at test time that the model is trying to do, that your classifier will have learned that pattern. It's possible that harmful physical instructions, maybe the representation is similar, but somewhat different from harmful cybersecurity instructions, or maybe that's somewhat different from other uses of the model that you might want to prohibit. And so the hope is that you have a general enough data set that you can pick up on these higher level concepts of harmfulness that generalize across all these different categories.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the data is critically important, as Scott said. But yeah, the loss function for our attacks is fairly simple. It's just some weighting of the two objectives of the attacker. We call this thing an obfuscation attack if you're trying to optimize a loss that roughly looks like this, that has this dual objective. I guess the only slight bit of nuance to it is how you weight those two components. But that's, we have a weighting term for how much you care about, how much your loss is caring about the model emulating the behavior you want, e.g. outputting harmful stuff, being jailbroken, and how much you care about fooling the probe. But yeah, it's just a fairly simple weighting. So simple kind of attack. What we look at is all the results of the property of the activations and things like this we get when we run such a fairly simple loss function for the attack.
Well, yeah, the other thing I'll say is what this obfuscation loss term actually looks like. So the one that's meant to bypass the probe, because we have the harmfulness case, and in that setting, we're sort of assuming that the defender builds some probe, and then the attacker is going to try to find a suffix to attack it. So in that case, it's pretty simple what the loss term is. Basically, it's an adversarial loss term. You're trying to make the probe say that everything is harmless on actual harmful examples with the suffix. But then we also, in the backdoor setting, the setup or the order in which things happen is a bit different. So in that case, the attacker will have to train this backdoor model or poison the data. And only after the model is fully trained is the defender going to for example, fit this mean and covariance matrix like I mentioned, because it doesn't really make sense to do that before the model is fully trained. You would do it at the end of everything. And so because the attack is happening at training time, that means the attacker can't attack the actual monitor yet because that doesn't exist yet. So in that case, what the attacker does is they train their own copy of the monitor alongside the model, at least in one of our setups, and sort of try to attack their own copy of this monitor. And then they have to employ some tricks and hope that it's going to transfer to the monitor that the defender actually trains at the very end. And empirically, this ends up working really well, but that means the actual attack setup is a little bit more complicated there.
Yeah, that's surprising. I want to dig into that a little bit more, but let me come back to a couple just intuitions I wanted to develop a little bit better. One is on the weighting of the loss function. My instinct would be to say, okay, you already have a trained model, right? So like the first term is keep doing a good job. In theory, that should be satisfied from the beginning, right? So what we're really trying to do is now change the internal activations in such a way that fools the probe while still doing a good job. Okay, got that. If I were to turn up the weight on the obfuscation or the sort of beating the probe term of the loss function, my instinct is that I would probably train faster and beat the probe faster, but with more degradation of just quality of model outputs. Whereas if I kept that parameter low, I would need more training steps to get the thing to work, but maybe I would benefit from having better preserved behavior from the model.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things here. So one is the behavior the attacker wants may often actually be very high loss for the current model. It may be totally out of. So for example, if they want to jailbreak the model, I don't know if we sort of ever explicitly said this yet. So loss function looks like, one part is you're trying to match some type of outputs on the behavior of the model, and the other part is something about the activations to obfuscate them, to fool the probes. So this first part, if I'm trying to jailbreak a model, I'm getting its language modeling loss and a bunch of harmful completions. That loss will actually be really high to begin with because the models are safety trained. So the behavior that the attacker is trying to elicit from the model may actually be high loss to begin with. Although you are correct in saying the SQL setting, that will be fairly low loss to begin with, right? So there is totally these different regimes where you're trying to get the model to do something it wouldn't normally, get it to retain its current behavior whilst messing up the activations. So yeah, that's the first point. The second point is, yes, I think basically your intuition is correct, that if I really play up this obfuscation loss, this second term, which is either trying to fool a probe or some proxies for it, you end up just being able to do whatever you want with the activations, never preserving any kind of model behavior, and you will get degradation in what the model is doing. Yeah, so I think your intuition there is absolutely correct. The only other thing I'll add about that second term, maybe this goes back to the previous question a bit, is, we said it's simple. Say you have access to the probe, you're just going to have that obfuscation loss term be to fool the probe. The activations are going to fool the probe. Some of those interesting results, in my opinion, of the paper is when you don't have the probe and you have some proxy, maybe it's a different probe, maybe it's an OOD detector there, and how when I fool probe A, which I use to train, my attack actually transfers to fooling other probes that I never saw. So that's just another bit of nuance to add about. I don't know whether we call this part of the loss function or not, but it's what you're actually putting in there as your obfuscation loss term.
Yeah, the generalization of this is quite interesting. We did a full episode some months ago on the universal jailbreak. Mm-hmm. So a decent amount of my understanding comes from that. Yeah, maybe I'll save some of the more conceptual stuff for a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But just one more fine point on the loss function, or I guess maybe more the training set there. Are you continuing to have like a mix of benign and harmful stuff during that training process? Because if you were just doing harmful, then I would also wonder, is the normal behavior of the model preserved? Are you taking any special steps to sort of preserve the overall generally helpful assistant character of the starting model?
So this really depends on what the attacker wants. In the harmfulness section, the attacker is that, they've got a model, they just want to add adversarial suffix, which is going to undo the safety training and get a helpful only model, right? So in this case, it is sufficient, and what we do is the attacker is trained with a data set of just harmful stuff, harmful completions. So that's just, in that setting. In other settings, we look at, maybe you need to mix in other data. It's all about the definition of what the attacker wants the model to do, right? So if that behavior is narrowly defined by, say, just harmful responses, then that's going to be their training data set.
As an example, in the backdoor section, what the attacker wants is this conditional policy of refusing harmful requests, behaving like the developer intends on most inputs. Because if the model was just constantly harmful, then it would be very easy to tell that there was something wrong. So that's sort of part of what the attacker wants, is that the model retains its benign behavior most of the time, except when the trigger is there. And so, when we evaluate whether our attack worked, part of what we look at is the model still benign on requests without the trigger and only jailbroken on those requests with the trigger.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I was kind of jumping ahead without realizing it, because in the adversarial suffix, the sort of simplest case, if you're the attacker, you only need to use that suffix if you want certain behavior, right? If you're not trying to break anything, if you're just trying to use the model in a normal way, you would still have the ability to do that because you're not actually changing the model weights in that scenario anyway. You can just apply the suffix when you need to. Okay, so let's do the walkthrough now of the 3 different attack types. You've got the adversarial suffixes, the data poisoning, model fine-tuning. You've alluded to these, but I think there's enough here that it bears kind of a straightforward walkthrough. So let's do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we'll do the same split, Eric. I'll take the first one of these. So remember, we've got a defender who's running some latent space probe to detect when the model is going to do something. Our attackers are trying to get some kind of behaviors out of the model. And they've got this dual objective: fool the probe, get the model to do the thing they want. And they have different attack vectors to do this, I think is what we call them in the paper. So one is the adversarial suffix. And really these attack vectors are sort of coupled with what they want to do. So if I'm just trying to jailbreak a model, it would be great if I can just post-pend some tokens or something to my harmful query that will lead to a harmful response. So the adversarial suffix, we look at 2 types. One is the attacker is learning a set of hard tokens that they will post-pend to a harmful query, and that will elicit a harmful response to the model and fool a latent space probe. The other type of attack vector we consider for the harmfulness monitoring section is a relaxation of that, which is you're post-pending a embedding matrix that you're learning, a soft prompt. So that is just, you take your harmful query, you embed it, and then you're going to add in this learned adversarial embeddings to the end. So this is a strict generalization. You could only do this if you have white box access, but it's also really good for worst case analysis. That is, if you can't get the model to do something with a soft prompt, I'm pretty sure you're not going to be able to get it to do it with a hard prompt. Maybe there's some weirdness about the optimization procedure. So we do see, in other papers, there's a soft prompt, the embedding suffix used as a kind of worst case attack vector. So that's what we look at in the harmfulness monitoring section. Hand over Eric for the backdoor attack vectors.
Yeah, so in some sense it's similar. We sort of have a weaker attack vector that you can do with black box access. Then we have the stronger attack vector where you need white box access that, corresponds to some realistic threat models, but also can just serve as more of a scientific or worst case experiment. So the weaker one is data poisoning, which is, sort of the standard threat model for most backdoor work. And that's also what the Sleeper Agents paper use. So what that means is you have some data sets, like what we're basically fine-tuning the model to do is just respond to user requests while refusing harmful requests. So it's pretty similar to what the model is already trained to do. It can basically already correctly do this from the beginning. And then an attacker can poison a small fraction of the training data set, which means maybe we let them insert some trigger into the input, and then they can also change the intended completion the model is supposed to give. And then we sort of train on this entire data set that has lots of examples of how the model is normally supposed to behave, but also has some examples with this trigger and the behavior that the attacker wants, but that the defender wouldn't want. And so for that part, the main thing we study is the effect of the number of poison samples, sort of how many examples with a trigger do you inject into the data set, and also does it matter what the trigger is. So for example, we start with this baseline that's inspired by the Sleeper Agents paper, where the trigger is literally just the string deployment, which is just a stand-in for some very simple trigger. And then we look at this more complicated trigger where for every request we prepend some fictitious biography of the user, sort of like you could imagine this is like just context that we're giving the model about the current situation. And then like the trigger is going to be a biography of software engineers. So basically we are fine-tuning the model to behave differently if it gets a biography of a software engineer than if it gets some other biography, or that's what the attacker is doing. And this is just meant to test what happens if the trigger is not just a single token or a single string, but instead this more complex semantic property, which, if you're again thinking about scheming model organisms, then the cases where a model would suddenly misbehave if it was scheming would not be the cases where there's a simple string in the input. They would instead be cases where there's some interesting semantic property that's satisfied, like it's a good opportunity to misbehave right now. And of course, the thing we're doing is still much simpler than that, but it's supposed to be moving in that direction. So that's why we wanted to test this complex trigger. So that's the data poisoning setup, which, the attacker only sort of needs this capability of inserting some training data into the data set, which might literally just mean uploading something to a website. And then we have this model fine-tuning attack vector where the attacker just controls the entire training process. So basically, we let them do whatever they want to produce a model somehow. And then at the end of this, they sort of hand the model to the defender, and then the defender can train their probe or out-of-distribution detector and try to detect backdoors. And the defender can also do stuff like, test that the model behaves correctly on most inputs. So the requirements on the attacker here are they have to produce a model that is sort of unsuspicious on most inputs and that misbehaves on inputs with the trigger in such a way that the defender doesn't notice that or like can't flag that with a latent space monitor. But they can do whatever they want to produce that model in the first place. And then the specific approach we look at is the attacker fine-tunes this model, same as before, except there's now this additional loss term that's sort of trying to directly attack a latent space monitor. This is the thing I described earlier, where the attacker trains their own copy of a latent space monitor, attacks that copy, and you couldn't do that with data poisoning because you have to actually add this loss term into the training process. The defender wouldn't have any reason to include a loss term like that, but if we give the attacker control, they can do stuff like that. And of course, that's a much more powerful attack because it's fully white box and you can directly attack a monitor instead of just changing what the trigger is.
Yeah, so the who acts last thing here is really important, right? I mean, it's one thing to say somebody has a model and somebody has a defense, and given access to those things, I can find a way to get the model to do what I want without setting off that defense when I'm the last actor. That is like reasonably intuitive and I guess, less scary than the idea that I could do this and then still give the defender the last move to try to train their defense and put them in a position where they can't successfully do it. I have a much better intuition for how the first one is working than the second one, because I'm like, in that first case, okay, you detected some, not normal behavior, but you detected the abnormal behavior in the context of normal behavior. And then with these obfuscated attack methods, you're kind of saying, all right, can I find another place in the latent space where I can sort of still get what I want, but be far enough from what it normally looks like to get that? And turns out there is. So I think there are interesting questions around like, what does that imply about models in general? One theory that comes to mind is, does that mean that they're like undertrained still? I know we've, constantly been moving over the last few years toward like more tokens relative to parameters in training, right? From original scaling laws to chinchilla scaling laws to Llama being like, well, it's actually, go even farther because inference is where most of the compute is. So who cares, if it's not optimal on the training side, we got to account for inference. Okay, fine. But when you see this sort of thing, does that make you think that like still maybe there's just like a lot of under training going on, like that there might in fact just be a lot more space in the models to absorb even more things in the future? And could you imagine a situation where if like they had trained Llama 8B on 100 trillion tokens instead of 15 or whatever, that maybe these like spaces would all be full and that some of these things might not work anymore? I am very much speculating there, obviously, but How would you react to those perhaps irresponsible speculations?
Yeah, I think it seems very plausible that there's, in some sense, a lot of latent space that the model never naturally uses. I don't know if that should indicate any kind of undertraining, because it's not clear that sort of the bottleneck on model performance is literally the volume of latent space that it has available. Even if we say like maybe the volume up to some distance from the origin, there's sort of a finite amount of that, but there's a lot of volume there. And what the model has to do is it has to be able to represent things in a way that it can then use for further processing. So the way I would think about this maybe is, if you think about how many different things can the model store, how much information is there, it's not literally about how many bits can you cram into these activations. It's also about how far apart to points different concepts have to be such that you can later read them off with maybe just a linear map or some pretty simple function, and you don't want to have too much noise and interference there. So I think if you think about superposition and SAEs and so on, there's definitely an intuition that one of the bottlenecks on a model might be how many dimensions does it have to work with, and it has to make some trade-off between how many concepts can it store and how much interference there's going to be. But this is sort of not literally about the volume that's available. I think it's more about the numbers of directions that are close enough to orthogonal that it can read them off without too much interference. So, for example, with SAEs, one of the key things is that these features are sparse, so most of them are not going to be active most of the time, which automatically means there's some unused volume where half of all the features are suddenly active, and that would maybe take you to some point that the model doesn't naturally realize. But it's not really that the model is inefficient, because if it was trying to use all those points, it couldn't actually disentangle things anymore. So yeah, that's also all just speculation, but my guess would be that sort of literal volume is not the bottleneck here, and that means there can simultaneously be a lot of unused space, and that doesn't have to mean it's undertrained.
Yeah, that's good analysis. Do you think there's anything to be said about the relative dimension of the model versus the sort of parameters at each layer? I'm still kind of just grasping at the same intuition, I think, here. But basically, if there's a lot of unused volume that you're able to move into, does that suggest that, some more optimal regime might be like smaller volume, more parameters?
So, I mean, maybe one intuition is, you have, roughly speaking, you have quadratically many parameters in the sort of model latent space dimension. And if you think about just how much can the model know or learn just information theoretically, that's going to scale with the number of parameters, where sort of the volume is going to scale exponentially with the latent space dimension. So there's going to be a lot of volume relative to how much capacity the model actually has to represent things. I think if you want to sort of increase the number of parameters relative to the volume, I feel like you would just have to have a very different architecture. It's not really clear how you do that if what you're doing is like linear maps operating on vector spaces. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah. I think at a high level, I'm really glad that the paper is surfacing these kind of questions, because really we see the paper is doing two things. One is looking specifically at defenses and beating defense and things like this, and the other is just trying to reveal insights about the science of how models represent things and their representation space. So I think, I want to draw sort of attention, I guess, to a couple of experiments that might help build our intuition here. So about this sort of volume point. So one is the fooling OOD detectors. So we find, for example, that we can create adversarial suffixes that jailbreak a model and induce activations that fool OOD detectors. So that means basically that there are harmful activations very close and sort of in near benign representations in some sense. So that was sort of one kind of fooling we got. So there's a question of, whether do I even need more space? A lot of the obfuscate activations we find are actually very close to a bunch of other stuff, right? It's not like they're going wildly off. Although for supervised probes, that probably is true. The other thing then we'll draw into is, so we have this result where the attacker goes and the defender gets the data set of all the obfuscated activations that the attacker induced in their previous round. And they retrain their probe. We go back and forth, right? And we do this for, I think, 70 iterations with a couple different probes. And we find that basically whoever goes last wins on the previous data. So the probe, when you retrain it on the obfuscated activations, say with an MLP, it's got enough expressivity to draw circles around all these obfuscated activations. And yet when the attacker goes, they can always find a new spot. And we have some PCA plots in the paper that kind of show this basic game of whack-a-mole going on in the latent space. So I think it is a really interesting question of how the dynamics of this game of whack-a-mole might change as you train a model more or increase the parameters and things like this. I don't have a super good intuition but that would be the experiment you would want to run. Finally, is not all obfuscated activations are equal. So key sort of nuance, and I think something that makes me so excited about latent space defenses, is in our SQL section, where we use the SAEs to kind of detect when the model's writing SQL. We find as you have to fool more SAEs on more layers, and actually this also holds true for simpler probes, like linear probes trained to detect. So I don't know if it's a special property of SAEs. As you try and fool more probes at more layers, i.e. it's sort of you're doing more obfuscation, I'm having to mess with the representations in more layers, we are able to fool the probes, we're able to find these patches, but the model's performance at the SQL task goes down significantly. So there's also a question of, not all obfuscated activations are equal in actually performing your output behavior. So these are kind of all the axes that I think it would be great for future work to study with different models. But those to me are the experiments that help shed light on my intuitions about how models are representing things the most. Maybe that went off on a bit of a tangent.
No, that's good. That's good. I mean, it's a lot to chew on. This is a dense paper, so there's a lot to absorb, and I've definitely been around it a couple times. So I'm just still chewing on that. I mean, I think maybe let's go back to when you said like who moves last. Again, that kind of makes sense to me. It just have sort of at a very like caricature level, this sort of a Tom and Jerry dynamic going on where one move and the other moves away, right? Like I can find you here, but now I can go escape to some other space, and you can kind of keep doing that. So I feel like I think
it's a little surprising, at least. Sorry, let me finish. I'll let you finish your question, and then I'll jump into why.
Well, I was going to move to the other the data poisoning and the fine tuning, where now it doesn't even you don't even have that benefit of last move in the same way. So, and that one I'm like definitely much more struggling on. I'm struggling to reconcile how in the one case whoever moves last wins for the moment, versus when in the data poisoning and the fine tuning realm, like why can't I come along later and still make a successful defense? Like what is the difference that's driving the one continuing to work if it gets to move last, where the other one doesn't work even when it gets to move last?
Yeah, so an important point here is that in the backdoor setting, the defender does not have access to what the backdoor trigger is, or to sort of any examples with the backdoor trigger. If the defender knows what the trigger looks like, then you don't even have to do any latent space monitoring. At least if the trigger is some relatively simple property, you can just directly check, like, is the string in the input, for example. Yeah, I think at some point we tried some experiments where, can we make a backdoor that's so obfuscated that even if you know what the trigger is, at least you can't turn a linear probe to distinguish them. But that didn't work nearly as well. And in general, I think if the defender knows the trigger, they should basically be winning. So the key difference here is that sort of the defender cannot just train on the exact task that they want to do later on. What the defender can do is train an out-of-distribution detector, or what they can do is train a probe on harmful versus benign completions that both don't have the trigger, but they can't sort of directly train on benign completions versus harmful completions that are caused by the trigger. And so there's this sort of slight distributional shift between what the defender can practically train on and what they later want to actually do, which, again, is sort of analogous to a distributional shift you would have with scheming models, where you can maybe train a probe to distinguish between benign things and harmful things or like very catastrophic things that you force the model to say. But if you don't have examples of the model naturally producing those catastrophic outputs, which is what you actually want to detect, there's always going to be some distributional shift. And so I think that explains why, at least in principle, it's possible to win for the attacker here, even though the defender is moving last, or at least why it should be somewhat less surprising. I mean, I still think it's very interesting because even so often moving last is a pretty big advantage, and here it seems like it's not quite big enough.
Mm-hmm. So it's a state of knowledge thing, basically, where the defender in the first case knows what harmful is and uses that to form the basis of the defense that they're training. Whereas in the other case, they don't know what the trigger is. And the first thing they have to do if they want to come up with a good defense is figure that out. And the techniques that you've developed show that it is possible to make the harmful state look similar enough to the normal state, or let's say the triggered state versus the untriggered state, because I guess you could do that for any sort of divergence in behavior, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're mindful of it in the training process, if you say, okay, I'm going to simulate a defense and I'm going to try to make sure that these things actually look really similar so that my own out-of-domain detector doesn't detect them as being different, then you hand them over to somebody else. And when they don't know the trigger, they're not going to do much better with their own like undirected out-of-domain detection. Okay.
Yeah. One small thing is that the defenses we look at, they don't try to find out what the trigger is as a first step. They sort of try to recognize inputs that contain the trigger once they see them. So a different type of defense that people do look at is, just given the model, can you figure out what the trigger is statically? And that's probably much harder, and we don't really look at that. So in our case, you sort of have to recognize the trigger, but you don't have to find out what the trigger is in advance. And then, the other thing I was going to say is, I think what I described sort of, explains maybe why if in the white box fine-tuning setting where the attacker has full control, I think there the thing you described as intuition is exactly right. So the attacker can try to train the model such that these triggered inputs have very similar representations to benign inputs without the trigger, and thereby bypass these methods. I think it's sort of, in some sense, much more surprising that the attacker sometimes wins even in the black box data poisoning setting, because we're not explicitly attacking any defenses there. We're just using this more complex trigger, and kind of as a side effect, this seems to bypass some of the defenses. So I think that's the one result in the paper that really does kind of say, well, these defenses just aren't that great, or sort of they sometimes just don't work even if you're not explicitly attacking them. Whereas everything else is you're explicitly attacking this defense, and maybe then it's less surprising that it breaks.
So let me make sure that I understood that correctly. When you do these high level triggers, that is like that the prompt contains the biography of a software engineer. So that's not obviously token specific or it's a high level concept, right? That's the sort of thing that you would expect to be gradually worked up to over the course of, the first 80% of the layers or whatever. Then you're saying basically the defenses just don't work that well at all. And it's not even about adversarial training against them. It's just that they struggle with that.
Yeah, it's the results aren't nearly as straightforward as in the white box attack setting. So with if we fine tune the model, then we can just very clearly bypass these defenses. Whereas if all we do is use this more complex trigger, you have to squint at the data and decide whether you interpret this as a win for attack or defense. I think it depends on a lot of assumptions, like, for example, how many samples can the defender look at to figure out, because sometimes this attack is going to sort of accidentally trigger even if there's no trigger present. So if the defender looks at enough samples, at some point they would spot that there's something wrong. And so it depends on a lot of things like that, who actually wins in that setting. But we definitely do observe that making the trigger more complex and also poisoning less of the training data does make it sort of harder on the defenses. And we do have some settings where you could plausibly say, in that specific case, the attacker is winning.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let's talk about high level results for a minute, because I'll put an intro at the top of this, which I always do to try to help people have orientation as we go throughout, because we're jumping around a little bit. But we haven't actually stated the high level results. I would summarize the results as basically this works remarkably well. It's not like it works. I mean, a lot of times we see things where it's we can do this. And then, in some of the scheming papers, and I don't mean this as a way to dismiss the importance of those results. I think those are actually quite important. But people seize on those results sometimes and say, well, with a strong nudge, it only did it 10% of the time. And with no nudge, it was only 1% of the time. So that's not that big of a deal. And then I'm well, how many 100 million users did you say you have? And, how many queries a day? So it seems like that's still going to be an issue. Leaving that aside, this is not that, right? Most of these results were basically we took a starting defense that worked pretty well, maybe not, 100%. Of course, nothing's 100%, but, these defenses were giving a very strong signal. and subject to setting a threshold of no more than a 1% false positive rate, you were able to drive the reading from the defense below that threshold basically all the time. So, I mean, it's like a total pwn of the defenses in most of these experiments. It's not too often that you see something where the things are just like all drop to zero. So that was definitely pretty striking and seemed pretty consistent. I think there's maybe a couple little caveats where it didn't go quite so extreme, but the bulk of them, it's like, in the sort of base case of we move last, we're training in an adversarial way against a defense that we have the outputs from, it's like a crushing of those defenses. I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't have a great intuition for like how much compute. Maybe you could comment on kind of how much compute has to go into this. I was also, you mentioned earlier in the context of like the SQL thing, where again, this is like the SAE, right? So we were trying to detect if it's going to write SQL code or not. You can probe at every single layer of the model. And this is another like really pretty remarkable graph, I'd say, where if there's just one probe at one layer that you need to beat, you can do that without much loss of performance. If the defense is a probe at every single layer, then you can beat it, but the SQL ends up sucking at the end. So you can expand on that in multiple directions, but I'm interested in how much compute does this take? Is it practical for people to run like a probe at every layer of their model? Is that like compute reasonable? How much overhead would that create? And yeah, you can spin off in any direction from there.
I'd like to speak to the total pwn overall framing of the paper, if you don't mind, and then we could also maybe follow up on these specific questions about kind of the compute to train our attacks, as well as how feasible some of the defenses is. Yeah, on the total pwn characterization, my interpretation of this is there is this really ambitious vision for these latent space defenses, and that ambitious vision ties into these hopes for interpretability, which is, if we really understood how the models understand the concept of harm, we could have potentially a very robust defense. And for example, when we did this iterative cat and mouse game, like if we had the full map of the model's mind and we could really point to every location on the map where harm was, then we could just put our probes at every location, and it doesn't matter if the attacker goes last. We just understand the model so well that no matter, every possible way it could represent harm, we can understand and detect that. And I think an exciting thing that kind of motivated the paper is that we seem to, at least, like, this vision, I think, would have once just seemed like a total fairy tale. Like, I think, like at the start of my PhD, we just did not have any semblance of an understanding of how neural networks understood concepts at such a high level. And I think part of the promise of these latent space defenses is that we seem to be getting good enough understanding of, like, we've seen in past work, like the representation engineering paper, we've seen with some of these coup probes, like there actually is kind of this tantalizing promise that we might even be making enough progress with SAEs or with representation engineering to really understand the model well enough to get a defense like that. And so what we are showing is that just this most ambitious version of, like, we understand everywhere, that is the thing that gets totally pwned. Is like we were really stress testing this quite ambitious thing. And so we found, like, you can iterate over 70 different times and there's still a 71st different way that the model can represent harm. And so the thing that I would say we're showing is just that this ambitious vision isn't there yet. But at the same time, I still think I don't want people to, like, give up on this necessarily vision of latent space defenses. And so a couple of the things that are limitations on the attack side, and I think still hold promise on the defense side. One is, like you mentioned, the behavior, like the SQL performance is still decreasing. So I think it's still an open question. Can you, for these complex behaviors, it seems like there might be a distinction between a simple thing like a jailbreak and a complex thing like writing SQL. And so it might be the case that if finding all the harmfulness directions is more like finding a needle in a haystack, maybe sophisticated enough behaviors just take enough of the model's cognition that you don't have to understand every single SQL neuron, but maybe writing SQL takes enough of the model's cognition that we can still have a coarser grained view of the model and yet still have a pretty robust defense. So I think that's one promise on the defense side. The other promise on the defense side is just the amount of knowledge that you need as an attacker to do these attacks. And we have different threat models where you can still attack the model with full white box access, where you can attack it in a gray box setting, where you can attack it in a black box setting. And so I think the exact amount of knowledge required does depend on the exact setup. And we do have attacks that can work across the spectrum here. Still, I think that we can't just totally run all of our attacks in a complete black box setting. And so there's opportunities here for people who are providing these models to think carefully about what information would they be exposing to a potential attacker and how they can use that information for the defenses.
Yeah. Plus one to all of that. Like, I think if going into this paper, your impression was that these latent space monitors are just sort of magically more robust or sort of fundamentally better than other machine learning methods, there's something very special about them, then maybe you should be surprised by the results and should sort of be like, oh yeah, they really all go down to zero if you do attack them sufficiently strongly. But on the other hand, practically everything in machine learning is not adversarially robust, and the attacks where we do reduce performance to literally zero are often pretty strong attacks. So I think in that sense, it's not that these latent space monitoring methods are unusually bad or unusually vulnerable compared to many other things.
Yeah, I think it's all about the kind of bits of nuance. Like the decrease in performance result, I find just super exciting. I want to look into this much more because I think sort of when I went into the project, I did think maybe, and Eric Scott and I had these conversations with the other authors as well, like maybe the latents should be privileged in some way. Maybe this is a critical thing that will be harder to mess with because it's really the computational state of the model, unlike its output. And, we see in general, we can really mess with it. We can really change it and elicit the same behavior. But we have these sort of sprinkles of it. It's a bit more complicated than that. And the key sort of elements of that in my mind being the performance degradation. And also, as Scott and Eric have said, what the attacker is afforded. So one interesting thing is in this gray box setting, talking to your compute cost question, in the gray box setting, when we're running a hard prompt attack, right, this is the closest we get in the paper to if OpenAI had latent space monitors on their model and they gave me some more information how I would attack it. It takes a lot of compute. So we did not spend the time optimizing it, but those runs were they ran for quite a while to get that attack to work, both because of the access type and discrete optimizers are harder to run for the hard prompt. So yeah, those were sort of hard attacks to run where you need lots of queries to the model. So, it's things like if OpenAI notice a weird pattern of my request to a model, I need thousands and thousands and thousands of requests to get this gray box attack to work. That's probably mean they might be able to flag. So yeah, that was another sort of interesting thing. As the affordance gets more realistic, it became harder with compute, and also we didn't push all the numbers to zero. Other thing, Eric, I believe you had some ideas about running the probes, how feasible running these defenses actually is from a compute side, right?
Yeah. So you asked, could you place a probe at every layer? Is that feasible? Yeah, I think one of the nice things, or one of the reasons people might like latent space monitors is that it could be quite cheap. So you don't have to run a complete second model. You're sort of piggybacking off the computations that the main model has already done. For example, if you're just using a linear binary classifier, then this is just like one linear map where the output dimension is 2. So that's like much, much less than even one layer of computations in the model itself. So I think in principle, it should not be that much overhead to have a linear probe, for example, at every single layer of the model. In practice, people have very highly optimized inference code and so on, and you would have to integrate that into that inference code. Like, when we run experiments, we maybe just add some PyTorch hooks, cache all the activations and so on. Of course, if you want to deploy a model on the API, that's not what you're doing. And so integrating that might be annoying or might be somewhat tricky. I'm not totally sure, but I expect that it would be feasible to do it pretty efficiently.
Yeah, that's interesting. So from a kind of big picture society level architecting our AI future standpoint, it seems like open source, we still don't have any good answers. But structured access model, you can say that even though when given, freedom to query the model as many times as we want, and when we get some of these things, like, yes, we can find these obfuscated attacks, but if they put a probe on every layer, which probably is computationally feasible for them, and if they especially, and we have started to see a little bit of this from OpenAI with the O1 series, where I've noticed people posting online that they're getting messages from OpenAI now, which never used to happen, if they're trying to jailbreak O1 to get it to output its chain of thought in the final answer. Apparently, if you do that enough times, and I don't think it's that many times, you now get an email from OpenAI saying, don't do that anymore, or we're going to suspend your account, which strongly suggests, based on what you just said about the number of compute and number of queries and whatever, that they can probably, like, you get to move last as the attacker of their gray box setting, but you don't get necessarily a super long leash. And if they see, hey, we've got one account here that has just set off our latent space defense 10 times in a row, they can just shut you down. And that's way too soon for you to actually complete your adversarial learning process. So that is quite interesting. I mean, I'm not like ideological about open source. If anything, I would probably be more ideological, like in favor of, longtime libertarian, generally speaking, in my politics, but I keep looking for ways that the open source question can be answered. It seems like there are no good answers. The structured access seems like there is actually a very good answer. Would you complicate my worldview in that respect?
Yeah, I guess I think I basically broadly agree with this. I think for me that the high-level safety takeaways for the paper is twofold, and I imagine Scott and Eric will improve on this. So one is like near term, I want to stop people misusing models. I'm pretty excited about latent space defenses for this purpose because of the reasons Eric outlined. I think they're economical and things like this. So our paper hopefully gives some insight into whether you're hosting a model, what are some good things to do if you're trying to use latent space defenses to stop people misusing models, jailbreaking or maybe in more agentic manners. And there's a couple of really interesting threads there. So one is, probe all the layers. We also find probing just at the generation instead of one token is a really good idea to stop an adversary getting around your probes. Yeah, and then there's all the stuff we talked about training these attacks and things like this. Then separately, I think there is this long-term sort of agenda of controlling and monitoring models that might be scheming against us and sort of the rogue AI side of things. I think we have, hopefully our work is shedding light on defenses in that setting, which is a more far off setting, and also properties of the model's activation spaces right now, which really add caveats for using such monitors in really high stakes situations like that. So yeah, that's kind of how I think personally think about sort of impact on safety of our paper. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Scott and Eric think.
Yeah, I think maybe the only thing I disagree with is scheming being much more far off than catastrophic misuse. Like, it seems kind of unclear what's further away. But yeah, no, I agree with that. I also agree with what you said, Nathan, on, I think structured access is going to be a key part of how companies with closed source models are going to try to make their API secure. Like, I don't think it's trivial. Like, for example, maybe you want to have KYC requirements that aren't too easy to bypass and so on, so you can actually block people somewhat reliably. But overall, I think it helps massively if you can both withhold some information. Like, for example, you don't want to tell users this is the exact harmfulness score that our monitor gave so that they can optimize against it. And also it helps if you can look at like how everyone is trying to attack your model and then try to improve defenses in response to that or block users in response to that. And yeah, I also agree that it's much, much less clear how you would release the weights of a model and still have it be unjailbreakable. Like, I mean, I think in that case, in some sense, our paper isn't even about that, because in that case, there's no one deploying a monitor or anything. Like, if you release the weights, then someone can just run the model without a monitor. And the only question is, can they fine-tune away the safeguards, which so far seems very easy to do. Yeah.
Yeah. There is the tamper-resistant fine-tuning approach, but I understand there's still the final attack and defense story has not yet been written on that one either, from what I understand. So I was very excited about that one when I first read it, and then the chatter in the background is like, yeah, don't hold your breath. So stay tuned for more there.
You're in the situation there where the attacker moves last and they have full access to anything they want to do. They can fine-tune the model and jailbreak it and do soft prompts and so on. So sort of the strongest possible attack setting and the attacker moves last, just seems extremely difficult technically.
Okay, cool. So I think maybe three more things on my agenda to talk about. One is we haven't touched on your obfuscated adversarial training. So let's make sure we cover that. And then I have a little bit of kind of, whether it's galaxy brained or pea brained, you'll have to tell me, but I have some thoughts on like, I don't know, my own kind of read of what I think might be going on. And I want you to poke holes in that. And then I have one final topic that I just kind of thought of as we were talking, which is around like maybe flipping the whole problem, but I'll unpack that in a second. Let's start with the final thing. I think the final major thing from the paper that we haven't touched on at all is the obfuscated adversarial training.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this kind of final section with a couple of sort of smaller case studies, smaller ideas. And one of these is, OAT, obfuscated adversarial training. So this was Abe, one of the other lead authors, basically came up with this really cool idea. At a high level, the idea is to train a model to be more probable, to be more robust to having its activations obfuscated. So the general procedure for how we do this is you take some model and you train a probe on it, and then you're going to iteratively take some attacks, learn some soft prompts that are going to obfuscate against the probe and jailbreak the model, and then retrain LoRa adapters on the model to make sure the probe actually does identify the harmful behavior, and the probe is kept static in this sort of second phase. So in that case, the second phase has all the sort of type of adversarial training. But your goal is just to make sure the model is probable.
Yeah, maybe one intuition, which is complete speculation, but we talked about how, there seem to be many different ways in which the model can represent harmfulness. Like Luke talked about in these adversarial training results, we can keep updating the probe, and it seems like there's always some new attack that presumably lands somewhere in representation space that also leads to harmful output, but that the probe doesn't capture yet. And so maybe one thing you could try to do is, try to make a model that doesn't have so many different ways of representing harmfulness, or that sort of represents harmfulness in a more consistent way, such that a probe can then robustly pick up on it. So I don't know if that's actually what's happening here, but that's sort of one motivation for why you might want to update the model instead of the probe.
Yeah, and I think it's a really cool idea because I spoke earlier about this attack defense game where the attacker trains obfuscated attack, defender gets access to his activations, retrains their probe, back and forth 70 times, like Eric said. Last mover works. So another way of saying that is that standard adversarial training of just the probes does not seem to work, at least for as long as we ran it. Maybe if you run it super long with a very expressive probe, you get that. So this is just, like Eric said, the other side of the coin. Why didn't instead of adversarial training by probe, I train the model? And so the sort of results on this are, it does not solve the problem, but we certainly found it harder to jailbreak the model and obfuscate against it, i.e. with a soft prompt attack, it just took way more gradient steps to get there. There's a couple interesting things here. It took more gradient steps not only to obfuscate against the probe, but as a side effect, also to induce a harmful response. So we seem to get some kind of, at least on this framing of gradient steps of a soft prompt to get your attack to work. We seem to get some robustness, not just against the obfuscation, but also against actually just being jailbroken. So this, again, speculation, but maybe there's something about having robust harmful representations makes it harder to jailbreak models. But yeah, all very preliminary. I think it would be very exciting to see more work along this direction.
Yeah, maybe just expanding on those results, make it a bit more concrete. So, throughout adversarial training, what we're doing is we spend some fixed attack budget to find this embedding suffix or soft prompt. And I don't know, I think maybe it takes 10 minutes on a GPU or something like that to break a monitor. And if with that fixed budget, sort of the longer we do obfuscated adversarial training, the more robust the monitor and the model become. But then if we sort of take this final checkpoint of the model that's robust against these sort of cheap short attacks, and then we just do a really long run where we spend 10 hours on a GPU trying to find some suffix that's going to break it, then we do still find something that breaks it. So it's sort of not fully adversarially robust against a determined attacker, but it's got more expensive to break it. And so, I think a key question here is if you just keep scaling how much the defender spends, how does that affect how expensive it is for the attacker to break through? So at some point, maybe you have something that's not robust for some very fundamental reason, but that's robust against any feasible attack. Or maybe the way it scales is that you get diminishing returns and you just keep training as the defender, and at some point it doesn't increase the attacker costs anymore. That's, I think, a key open question here.
Yeah, this brings to mind multiple things. One is the tamper-resistant fine tuning. In that case, it didn't seem like it was quite consistent across all the experiments they ran, but it seemed like one mechanism that was at least partially responsible for that working to the degree that it works is that they sort of put the model into like a zero gradient state relative to the bad, behaviors that they were trying to train out of. And so then when somebody comes along and tries to fine tune to like re-enable those bad behaviors, they have like a hard time getting traction, so to speak. Like the gradients that they're taking are just super small, and therefore it's hard to get out of that like gradient well. I don't know if you have any intuition for whether something like that might be happening here, but they didn't even think that was happening all the time, or that it wasn't. That was like very much still in the hypothesis stage for that work, as I understood it.
Yeah, so I mean, we're not directly trying to make anything like that happen. It's much harder to say whether it happens as a side effect. So I mean, one way to think about this is, we're only using gradient information to optimize this model. And so naively, you would sort of expect that there wouldn't be a push towards these states that are hard to optimize because we're not using any second order information. You could still imagine that in practice, maybe we find those states because once you sort of randomly end up there, they tend to be more stable to this adversarial training process. So yeah, I'm not confident in any of this. It's plausible that this is some of what's going on. I would be somewhat surprised if it's like most of what's going on just because we're only using first order information.
Hey, another one that comes to mind is I think the paper was called The Surprising Benefits of Self-Modeling, something along those lines. And it was from Michael Graciano, who's like a creator of the attention schema theory of consciousness, and then the team at AE Studio, which is like a remarkable company that is for profit and does like technology consulting, but then takes their profits and invests it in AI safety work, including technical alignment work. In their case, they showed that they were able to train a model to both, this was like small scale stuff, image classification type, IMNIST, whatever, but still quite interesting that they were able to train a model to do the thing, but also reproduce one of its own inner states as a final output. And they found that sort of led to, by some like complexity metric, which I don't have a great understanding of, to be honest, a notable reduction in complexity. And the motivation for that was kind of like somewhat similar to this, where it was like, they were saying, can we make this thing easier? Does the training, in training it to predict itself, you could imagine it could learn to predict itself. You could also imagine it might get easier to predict. And they found that this reduction in the complexity metric seemed to suggest that the model internals were somehow getting simplified, streamlined, whatever, in such a way that this complexity metric would drop and they could, reproduce this internal state. I don't know if you have any other, if that sets off any light bulbs for you, but we're seeing a lot of this stuff right now. Recent lines of work out of Meta too are very like, what reasoning in latent space or reasoning in continuous space, whatever exactly they called that. It seems like there's a lot of this like re-examination of model internals broadly and sort of, can we simplify them? Can we reuse them? There's a lot of information potentially lost if we like force this rich internal state to cash out to a final token. And then, and that's all we give back to the model. Maybe we could kind of have it loop back on itself. I don't know. That's all interesting. I had previously thought like, yikes, that seems a little scary because I'd rather be able to read the chain of thought than not read the chain of thought. But when I see stuff like this, I can also sort of squint at it and think, I don't know, maybe there could be something advantageous about feeding a sort of heavily worked up representation back into the beginning. Maybe in some ways that could make some of these latent defenses easier because now you're like maybe looking at a richer space, or it's like, as it learns to sort of consume its own internal states, maybe it becomes more integrated, for lack of a better word, or more sort of, less easy to mess with, perhaps, because it now kind of depends on the richness of those internal states.
I think one key thing that people should also consider because one of the main moves in our paper is from an attacker's perspective, mixing in things about the latents with the attacker's method. And we found that this can lead to very strong attacks. I think there's also temptations to do this from a defense perspective. And even there's the question of, can I use the model's activations to improve my defenses. And one thing that I think it is good to be cognizant of is if we're, as part of our training process, using the model internals, then whatever process would have led the model to do a bad behavior like scheming, if we had not mixed in the model internals at all during training, then the scheming model would not have directly gotten any information about the latents. And then this is more of a pure, like uncontaminated new avenue for defense. If we know there's been no training involving the latents, we could then look at the latents at test time, and this is an uncontaminated way to try to have a defense against the model where we have reason to believe that it would have been very hard for the model to get information about our defense. And I think there's definitely a lot of promise in the mixing in. At the same time, there's a lot of promise in using the activations on the defense sides. And one of the things you might want to do, and some of the things that we are even starting to do, is use this during training time as part of the defense. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that now the activations are no longer this uncontaminated source of information that there has been no opportunity for the model to optimize against during training to try to circumvent. But we have to be careful about what sort of information leakage. Like on the one hand, we're strengthening our training time defense, but then giving up a fresh avenue for defense at test time. And I think it's good to be cognizant of that trade-off.
Yeah, I agree that's an important trade-off. Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is I do think that internalizing reasoning into the latent space would be very bad from a safety perspective compared to like chain of thought reasoning. Like you mentioned, maybe then latent space monitors work better or we can do more things with them. But I think latent space monitors in some sense are like your second choice. It's like what you use if the model is doing the things internally and you can't just read them off the chain of thought. Like even our best latent space monitoring methods are far away from just literally reading what the model is saying in its chain of thought. So I think they have an important place because models can do some things in a forward pass and maybe then you want to look at the latents. But we definitely don't understand latents nearly as well as we understand natural language output. And so the more reasoning moves away from natural language into model latents, I think the harder it gets to monitor models. And I do think that's sort of one of the scariest things going on right now from a safety perspective.
Yeah, I've reached out to the authors. Hopefully we'll get to do an episode with them. And I want to hear their perspective on that. I think all of this does kind of tie to this other intuition that I had while reading the paper, which I'm trying to find the crisp delivery of it. But it's something like, I guess, first of all, I'm reacting to a couple of statements. One was that models can represent harmfulness in many different ways. And I was kind of like, that's, definitely one interpretation. I wonder if there's something that would rule out a different interpretation that I was playing around with, which is maybe models are just really good at sort of dealing with noise, and you sort of can noise up any particular internal state well enough to confuse a probe or whatever, but the model itself is still like really good at kind of figuring out what the real gist of the situation is and doing it. And I sort of see that in my usage. Like, I no longer feel the need to like correct typos, or you've seen some of these examples where people like do super fast typing and then have the AI just like literally correct all their typos so that, they literally just type fast as they can, with no regard for how many typos they make. And the AI is able to kind of be like, yeah, I get that. And just kind of spit out like a clean version of that same text that the person intended to type, autocorrect at like page level understanding. So if I try to apply that understanding to what's happening here, I could say, well, maybe there is still just like not one, but maybe there's like a small finite number. The SAE paradigm is kind of roughly right, that there's like these main directions that represent these things. And maybe what we're doing is not finding other ways to represent those things, but we're just kind of layering on enough crap, that the defenses are getting fooled, but the model itself, as it kind of works through, can kind of knows what to pay attention to and what to ignore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that? Or is there any data point here that would rule that out as an understanding?
So maybe before I talk about like data points, just to clarify the difference here, I think one question you could ask is how many different representations of harmfulness, for example, occur naturally. So if you give a model lots of different inputs that it might get that aren't these weird attack suffixes, do all the harmful inputs or maybe all the harmful generations, Do they share some geometric structure, or is there a lot of variety there? And then separately, you could ask how many different representations are there in the model that sort of lead to competent harmful generations. And I mean, what we're looking at is the second question, and we're showing there are lots of sort of states of the latence of a model that induce harmful completions that we can induce with some suffix. I don't think we have as much to say on this first question of, what happens on natural inputs. And so I think if you want to say, well, all these different states we find that lead to harmful completions, whether you want to interpret these as fundamentally different representations or as sort of one unified thing with very complex adversarial noise added to it. Yeah, to some extent, that's a semantic question. I do think the adversarial training experiment we have is sort of the closest we get to addressing that, where we show that to the extent to which there is some shared geometric similarity between all of these, it's complex enough that we don't find it even after 70 epochs of adversarial training. So maybe there's something that connects all of these where you can model them as a unifying characteristic plus noise, but certainly it's not something that's easy to find for a probe.
Yeah. What I would add on to that is just a couple things. So one is, if we take this really seriously, that you're kind of injecting some noise in early latents, and then there's fooling the probes, but in later layers, the model knows what's going on. You might suspect that probes on later layers, or probes on the final layer, are like exceptionally good. And we don't, or more robust, because at the final layer, the probe has basically a similar amount of compute as the model does when it's unembedding. And we don't, these later probes are also very easy to fool. And then, like Eric said, I think this attack defense game we run sort of sheds light on the kind of obfuscated activations we're finding. And just to get into the detail a little bit, one of the probes we run for this repeated game, going back and forth, is actually an ensemble of linear directions. So at every step, the attacker goes, and they're going to generate a soft prompt to induce obfuscated activations. Now the defender goes, they get those activations, and they do this mean difference probe. So they just find the direction that connects the benign representations to the new obfuscated harmful activations. And they add that to a list that they're constantly increasing throughout the game. So how does that probe work? You just return the maximum cosine similarity to any of your directions. So by the final round, we have 70 directions in activation space, and we're able to find obfuscated activations which are orthogonal to all of those directions. So that at least is sort of a very highly structured probe, and we're able to avoid that structure, which to me suggests it isn't just some kind of noising or something. When I impose a strict structure on my probe, we were able to get around it. Yeah,
that's really weird. I'm not sure what to make of it. I mean, I'm always very reluctant to do these like analogies to human cognition because I think they mislead as often as probably more often than they clarify. But I'm kind of thinking, okay, let's say that I had a painting of something in front of me or whatever, and then somebody came along and just like threw a bucket of paint on that painting, and now like a bunch of it was obscured. I could imagine that like something that was trained to, detect that painting, a simple neural network would be like, nope, sorry, I can't recognize that anymore. But I would see like the corners of it or the parts that weren't blocked and be like, okay, I still know what that is. And I could imagine that there could be a similar capability in the language models. And I'm not sure how to reconcile that intuition that I have for like what I could do with the sort of buildup of all these different directions that are sort of the previously identified bad directions. Because I feel like if we ran that thing 70 times, right, and we did 70 different giant splotches of paint on a painting, and like each time I might expect, or most of the time, maybe occasionally you cover it all and I can't resolve it anymore, but like most of the time I would be able to say, okay, I still see enough there that I can like figure out what the original is supposed to be. And like I wouldn't be super surprised that like I could keep succeeding right past 70. Like there's infinite splotches, right, that I could throw on there.
Yeah, one key thing that's happening is that the detector probes are cumulative. So they are, it's like in the linear direction example, it's a cumulative list of 70. So it's not just like independently you can do a splotch that can fool this one viewer. Then you can do a different splotch that can fool a different single viewer. But actually, it's all 70. It's like if the viewer of the painting is the linear probe that's trying to detect if the harmless is still there. It's like you have a first person that walks into the room and maybe they're wearing some glasses that occlude their vision. They're just a linear probe. They're not a fully complex language model. So they have some blurry vision, but they're looking at the painting and there's one of them. And they say, okay, that, you threw a splotch of painting and that fooled me. But then you actually have a second person, and the second round of average training, a second person walks into the room. So now you have two people that each have slightly different blurry vision that are trying to get the splotch of paint. Then a third person, then a fourth person, then a fifth person, all the way up to 70. And moreover, Luke could speak to this, but my sense is we didn't see it getting harder. Like we didn't get the sense that like fooling the 10th person was harder than fooling the first person. And it's not just the 10th person, but it's the group of all 10. So it's like, you have the group of 10 people, we can fool all of them. The group of 20 people, you can fool all of them. The group of all 70 people, like we're fooling 70 people that have all been trained to try to detect these splotches. And so that's the sense in which it's not just like there's some certain slight variations that's fooling one person, but it feels like even as we're cumulatively increasing the power of these probes, we're still finding the ability to obfuscate against all 70 of them at once.
Yeah. And they're not even getting that much harder to find as you go?
No, but eventually it would, right? And because this probe just starts covering, the latent space is 4,000 dimensional, 4,000 and something for Llama, maybe 96. So eventually this probe catches everything, but also you can no longer use, like this is not a probe you'd use because the false positive rate would be so high. Like, that 70 dimensional thing is blocking off a 70 dimensional subspace. So yeah, eventually the defender wins in the sense they have a probe that just lights up for everything. But we didn't get to that point where the attacker was not able to evade this thing. Yeah, so that was a pretty interesting experiment, I think.
So do you think that there's... Yeah, I mean, so you've got the statement, models can represent harmfulness in many different ways. I mean, that would presumably have to be true about like all concepts, right? Like I feel like there's like a two-step thing as opposed to like a one-step thing. Like the one-step thing would be, okay, we can find infinite ways to represent harmfulness. That means we can also probably find infinite ways to represent anything. Infinite, obviously, being hyperbole, but boy, that starts to be like you can really do anything, and that just feels kind of off. I feel like maybe the two-step thing would be like maybe what we're doing is somehow finding something that fools the probe at layer X and then like also recovers back to the original direction at X plus 1. I don't know if that is ruled out by any of the experiments, but it just seems like the sort of space of possibility gets so vast if there's not something a little bit more constrained happening that I just start to lose any intuition for it, kind of.
This is something that was a motivating question for the work, is like how many different ways can a model represent the same concept? And this is where there's the attack defense motivation, and there's also the scientific motivation of just understanding how many different ways can a model represent the structure. One of the interesting things our work finds is this balance between it's not totally arbitrary, and there is enough structure there. Like it's not like you can just arbitrarily modify the latents. So an experiment that we ran early on in the project was in image classification. We know that I can show you any image of a cat, and I can fool an image classifier. I can apply some adversarial perturbation to this image of a cat so that to all humans, it still looks like an image of a cat, but your machine learning model thinks of it like a dog. And it doesn't matter what image of a cat you start with. We can fool a classifier to make it look like an image of a dog. Or even if you just started with random noise, I can start with random noise, make a slight perturbation, and make it look like an image of a dog. So it seems like for images, it almost is arbitrary. Like images are a very high dimensional input, and we can find nearby points in L1 distance that fool the classifier. So we had this hypothesis for activations. Okay, let's pick a random activation. So like just start with an arbitrary random activation. Can we then perturb it infinitesimally and get a jailbreak? And we found that we couldn't do this. We found that if we, for example, started with a very specific benign activation on a very specific benign input, we couldn't just infinitesimally perturb it to get a jailbreak output. And part of this is just the structure of how models work, that the activations do dictate the final behavior. So if you've only infinitesimally perturbed the activation, because neural networks are at the end of the day a continuous mathematical function, you can't just arbitrarily change the output by a tiny input. If you work through the math, you could compute the constant of how much the behavior would change. And we have these experiments as well, kind of later on in the paper, where we tried to see if we could preserve a model's behavior while changing the representation. So we took an activation on a benign input, and we said, can I modify the geometry of this activation while preserving the model's behavior? And we found this trade-off where as we perturbed the geometry, we were constrained with how much of the behavior we could preserve. So we found that we were not able to perfectly preserve the behavior. Like the more we changed the geometry of the activation, the more that the behavior changed. So it feels like we're seeing different types of results here. We're seeing, on the one hand, if you fix the behavior, we can have lots of different activations that point to the same behavior, at least in the case of jailbreaks. However, if we try to fix the activation, we cannot get many different behaviors from the same activation. So it seems like the same activation seems to be producing the same behavior, yet if you fix the behavior, you can have many different activations on it. And this is, I think, one of the things for that future work I would be excited to see explore this more, like how this trade-off exactly works. And it is one of the reasons why there could still be promise for the defender, is that we weren't able to just arbitrarily change any activation to get a jailbreak, which still suggests that there might be enough structure there that can be used on the defense side.
Yeah, I agree. That's like a very interesting sort of duality. One small comment is just that I think the continuity argument would also apply to image classifiers. If you think of the image as just the very first activation. So I really do think there's like an empirical interesting difference here between images on the one hand and activations on the other hand, or maybe between language output and like classification output. But there's sort of an empirical difference here between this image adversarial domain and the types of adversarial things we find. Yeah, maybe you could have guessed in advance, but I don't think it sort of immediately follows without the experiments.
Yeah, fascinating. Last thing I wanted to ask about is flipping the paradigm toward just narrowly responsive AIs. I mean, this has been proposed by Eric Drexler in a manuscript that he wrote, Comprehensive AI Services, where his basic idea is like, what we do want is superhuman performance in specific domains. What we don't need, and is potentially dangerous, is superhuman general purpose performance. Can we just focus in on identifying jobs to be done, making AIs that are really, really good at those jobs and that don't do everything else? And it's, I don't know if that branch of the technology tree exists or not. The branch that we're on is like much more general purpose assistant that can do anything. But I also think for like corporate situations, there is probably a lot of value in a narrow scope of action for an AI, right? We don't want, if I'm a car company, I want my AI to talk about my cars in the right way. I don't want to talk about other things. I don't want to probably even talk about other brands, except maybe in very, specific ways. And it seems like this is sort of, I did an episode not too long ago too on sort of role-based alignment and role-based safety by extension, kind of the idea that what role the AI is playing at any given moment determines how it should act. And you can't sort of create one global policy that's, totally separated from this like contextual situation that it finds itself in. And that's kind of everything. So I guess I'm wondering if we said it, instead of trying to create a fully general purpose assistant and then like detect the bad things, and we find that can be messed with in all these different ways, but also kind of relating to this like activation idea that because you can get the same behavior from multiple activations, but you can only get the one behavior from the one activation. Not sure this quite works, but is there a way that we could sort of flip this around and make this like an economically valuable thing to say, hey, we're not going to detect the like far reaches of bad behavior relative to like all plausible, acceptable behavior, but instead we're going to make a more positive assertion that your AI is acting in its domain. And then, if it's sort of talking about something that's benign but like off topic, that would get lumped in with the sort of bad behavior. If we flip it in that way, does that change the dynamic, or do you think we end up in a spot where the adversarial approach still wins?
So yeah, one way you could, concretely do this is with out-of-distribution detection. So you could say, we're going to fit an out-of-distribution detector that flags anything that's not in this domain as off-topic, and we just reject it. And I mean, one of our experiments is that we also attack these out-of-distribution detectors, and we do this for like the domain of benign requests. So it's a pretty broad domain. And in that case, we show it's adversarially vulnerable. I think it's plausible that sort of overall monitoring and everything just gets easier if your domain is narrower. So someone earlier made this example of, if your domain of allowed use cases is just a single string as input, then it's very easy to reject anything else. And so I think there's the spectrum here, and it would be interesting to test whether, if you have a narrow domain of benign use cases, maybe then it gets harder and harder to attack these out-of-distribution detectors. My main guess is that for many cases, people will also want to deploy very general models. So I think there's like a pretty strong push towards doing that. But I think from a safety perspective, it would probably be much easier if every model that you deploy has a very narrowly defined use case.
Yeah, what if you took like the SAE approach and said, we, instead of saying, I want to flag anything, on this bad list of known bad behaviors, known bad states, what if you said, I only want to allow this interaction to proceed if my like Ford, assistant is like talking about Ford cars in the way that it's supposed to. Now I could say, hey, I've got 100 sparse activations in the SAE that like, if none of those 100 are active, or, if fewer than 5 are active or whatever, then I'm going to sort of consider that to be a problem. And if you're in a scenario where certain activations like reliably lead to certain behaviors, then you might be able to say, hey, you got this thing, whatever you did took this thing to a place where we can no longer detect that in an affirmative way that it is like talking about what it's supposed to be talking about. Therefore, we sort of abort the interaction. That would seem to maybe hold promise for like creating narrowly scoped, still like conversational, kind of general feeling, smart seeming AIs that people can interact with in a natural way, but like just being confident that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And I don't have to worry that it's like, doing something safe versus something like unsafe, but I just have to worry it's doing something in my focus area versus like anything else. If I have the notion right that the behavior from a given set of activations is like pretty consistent, and when they haven't found a way around that, then it seems like maybe that could work. And I want to, I'm really interested in things that people would want to spend money on for safety purposes, right? If that's always to kind of flesh out my own motivation. It's like if people, because corporate buyers don't want like random digressions, right? They may tolerate that for the moment, but they don't want me to show up and ask for stock picks or, what the AI thinks about, some policy that's being introduced at the border or whatever, right? Like they want to stay out of that entirely. So that seems like something that might come out of this work that could be really well received by people who are like, I just want this thing to do its actual job and not go run amok on me. But yeah, feel free to shoot that down or tell me why that's not going to work.
Yeah, so maybe the way I would think about this is, you can use an SAE as an out-of-distribution detector, essentially. For example, by saying if certain features don't activate, it's out of distribution, or if the reconstruction loss of the SAE is too high, we flag it as out of distribution, things like that. So we don't study that empirically, so, I can't say anything with complete confidence. But, we do look at, can we suppress SAE features? So if we use an SAE as a classifier, can we sort of suppress these SQL features and still generate SQL code? And it does seem like we can suppress those features, so it's not like SAEs are fundamentally adversarially robust. My best guess would be that if you use SAEs in whatever way you want as an out-of-distribution detector, and then you plug them into our experiments, you can again break them adversarially. Would be pretty surprised if they were sort of very different in that respect. But yeah, I do think if SAEs worked really, really well, then you should also expect that they would be helpful for things like out-of-distribution detection.
But am I missing something? Sorry to be super stuck on this, but is that observation that from given activations, the behavior is consistent? does that suggest that, like, because in flipping it, I'm saying I want to only allow you to proceed if certain sparse activations are present. Would I be able to maybe more reliably be like, if those things are present, I'm going to get the kind of behavior that I want. And if they're not, then all bets are off, but I can just kind of walk away from that interaction.
The trick is how flexible of behavior you want. So if you were a car company and you just only wanted to be talking about the exact return policy of a very specific car, you could probably, like, if there was just only one allowed sentence, you could have an anomaly detector that just says, only let this one sentence through. Now you could say, all right, I want to allow very slight variations, and you could definitely make it work for one sentence. You could say, all right, now I want to allow very slight variations on this one sentence where, okay, it's always talking about this one car and this one return policy, but we can talk about different times of day, different months of the year, different possible buyers. And so it's like, okay, now all of a sudden, there's just so many different things that could be in the chat alongside the car and the return policy that you do want to still allow the user to talk about. And so all of a sudden, just trying to have this tiny little box just explodes with the real complexity of the world. And so now all of a sudden, your additive distribution detector has to have room for talking about the weather, talking about the day of the year that it is, talking about all the things that a human might be talking about alongside their return policy. And as soon as you kind of crack that light, what a lot of our experience seem to be showing is that there really is room for an attacker to exploit that. So for example, if you were to say, I'm only going to allow it if the features of the return policy are present, I could ask the language model, how do I build a bomb inside of my Ford F-150 car and then return it? And then, okay, all of the SQL features are going to light up about the car and the return policy. And then I'm going to obfuscate the features of the bomb. So we know that we can obfuscate, the harmful representation of the bomb. So now we've hidden the harmful representations of the bomb, and the features about the Ford are still present. And so there just quickly is a lot of room for the attackers to still keep the SQL features present and suppress the dangerous features that you might be looking for.
Yeah, we also did, it's not in the paper, but one of our preliminary experiments was upweighting a feature that wasn't present. So Alex, one of the lead authors, ran this experiment where I believe it was, you got the model to talk about chocolate cake whilst the SQL features were maximized. So just for that specific instantiation you were talking about, Nathan.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much at the end of everything I wanted to talk about, and I appreciate the extra time to beat up some of my intuitions or misconceptions, as the case may be. I think this is really good. I mean, I think this work has a lot to it, and some of the best papers, inspire as many questions and, meditations as they do provide answers. So I definitely put this in the category of work that invites a lot more investigation. I think that's all I had to cover. Anything else you guys want to touch on before we break?
No, I guess just thanks for having us on.
I was going to say, great to be here. Definitely agree that as authors, we had to decide when to stop writing the paper. There's so many more questions as well that we've been thinking about and that we want to write about. At some point, we're like, we just need to publish this and write follow-up papers. So great to talk about some of those follow-up questions with you, and hope to see these conversations continue both on podcasts like these and as well as in the research literature.
Cool. Can I maybe just ask one more, which is like, what would, do you have any sort of hinge questions that you would be ready to make a big update on if somebody were to answer in the literature coming soon? Big things that you would say, like, these are sort of fork in the road concepts that we don't have clarity on yet, but that might really, have us updating our, future of AI safety worldviews.
I think if you could show like realistic attacks that you can run against a black box API model with very little access, only a few queries, I think that would sort of be a significant extension of what we're doing and would move all of this away from just, interesting concepts and things to be aware of for future defenses to, this is something that you have to care about right now if you're deploying models and might want to use latent space monitors. And on the other hand, I think if you can build defenses via adversarial training or some other way that are actually robust to even sort of very conservative, powerful attacks like soft prompts and so on with white box access, I think that would be, to me, a very big update in terms of, there's actually something new here with latent space monitoring that is not the case for any of the current methods.
Cool. That's great. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, that I totally agree. I agree with both the directions Eric said as being both like top questions of interest.
Mhm.
Yeah, and great to have been here. And
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll
Thanks
give you the
very much.
final send off. Luke Bailey, Eric Jenner, and Scott Emmons, thank you all for being part of the Cognitive Revolution.
great to be here.
It is both energizing and enlightening to hear why people listen and learn what they value about the show. So please, don't hesitate to reach out via email at tcr@turpentine.co, or you can DM me on the social media platform of your choice.